Good morning, good evening to everyone, wherever you're joining us from around the world. I hope you're all doing well. Welcome to the next episode of the Voices of Sustainability virtual fireside chat series. I'm Julia Piper, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. I'm also host of the Political Climate podcast supported by the USC Schwarzenegger Institute. And I'm really honored to say I'm a judge at the Zayed Sustainability Prize's Energy Award. It is always such an honor to participate in the Zayed Sustainability Prize. I'm reminded of the incredible passion and ingenuity around the world among people for solving just some of the greatest problems there are today. With that said, the Zayed Sustainability Prize was founded in 2008 as the United Arab Emirates Pioneering Global Award for recognizing organizations and global high schools for their sustainable, innovative, and humanitarian solutions. Today, the prize counts 14 years of global impact, with 370 million people around the world benefiting from its winners' solutions across categories of health, food, energy, water, and global high schools. On today's episode, we'll delve into the topic of financing the gap with our guest speakers. Introducing them now, I will start with Ms. Surabhi Visser, who is the Chief Investment Officer of SunFunder, a specialist financing company dedicated to solving climate change and energy access. Surabhi is responsible for the healthy growth of SunFunder's portfolio by developing bankable financial solutions that address clients' capital needs and growth strategies. Hello, Surabhi.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Next, we have Rebecca Bregant, who is president and chairwoman of the Alliance for Rural Electrification in Belgium. She works on promoting a sustainable, decentralized renewable energy industry for the 21st century. Rebecca is also co-founder and CMO of Pineberry, a German-Kenyan social business providing an everything-as-a-service platform for scaling energy access in emerging markets. Hello, Rebecca.
Thank you, Julia. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Great. And last but not least, we have Mr. Colin McQuistan, who is head of climate resilience and practical action at Practical Action, a 2017 Zayed Sustainability Prize winner and a nonprofit organization that helps reduce energy poverty through advocacy and direct intervention. Colin works at both the country and global levels to explore the critical advocacy and knowledge generation that's needed to reduce the risks to poor and vulnerable communities around the world. Hello, Colin.
Hi, Julia. Really great to be here.
Fantastic. So before diving into our discussion with our excellent guests, I wanted to take just one more moment to set up what we're talking about here today. We're living at a time when many prominent leaders are starting to feel actually a little optimistic about climate progress. Former US Vice President Al Gore, who's known for his landmark documentary An Inconvenient Truth, actually said last year that he's feeling better about the progress we're making as a world on combating climate change. As an example, the proportion of newly installed electricity capacity coming from solar and wind stands at around 90% today. However, there is still an enormous amount of investment needed to meet our climate goals. If we hope to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, we need to bring global emissions to net zero by 2050. Getting there will require trillions of dollars of public and private finance, as the globe also confronts, as I think we all know, some broader challenges and disruptions. In particular, the need to mobilize capital to support climate action in developing countries is crucial, and it is falling short. Today's discussion will focus on how much funding is needed to achieve an equitable transition to a prosperous and sustainable future, particularly for those who need it the most. So without any further ado, Rebecca, I'd like to go to you first. We're going to confront the challenges head on. So transition to a green economy can unlock new economic opportunities and jobs. According to a recent study from the World Bank, an investment of just $1 on average yields about $4 in benefits. And the new climate economy report issued in 2018 found that bold climate action could yield a direct economic gain of $26 trillion through 2030 compared to a business as usual scenario. So with these advantages clearly documented and glaringly obvious, what are the obstacles standing in investors' way, preventing them from committing more to net zero solutions?
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, that's indeed a very interesting question. So in terms of our status and the challenges, there are still 600 million people that have no access to electricity at all in the world. And we have 2.8 billion people without reliable power. So there are still 90 million connections per year required to achieve full electricity access in sub-Saharan Africa alone. So yeah, we need to accelerate the current yearly rate of renewable electrification threefold. And 55% of least cost connections until 2030 are to come from DRE, which means decentralized renewable energies. So thanks to the sustained efforts of the DRE industry led by ARE, DRE is no longer a niche market. And despite the often challenging market conditions, the strong value proposition of DRE companies means that to date, at least 470 million people rely on DRE. And private companies in the sector have raised more than 2.1 billion US dollars in corporate financing and finance from 2010 to the end of 2019. So talking about obstacles, well, more needs to be done to scale and standardize the DRE market. In particular, we need to de-risk commercial investments in the sector at scale. And what ARE currently does to contribute here is we collaborate with GetInvest to mobilize DRE investments in sub-Saharan Africa, build the enabling environment, and improve investment readiness of DRE companies on a global level, but also in specific focus countries in sub-Saharan Africa, such as Mozambique, Burundi, Eswatini. Also, we collaborate with the African Development Bank to de-risk investments in DRE companies and projects across Africa through our dedicated Africa desk. Also, we have established global collaboration with IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, which is the main intergovernmental agency for renewables in the world. So ARE and IRENA jointly work on de-risking investments in energy access and decentralized renewable energy, as well as on activities aimed at increasing private sector participation in the same.
Fantastic. Thank you for that overview. And DRE meaning decentralized renewable energy, correct? So these are promising solutions that don't need the same amount of infrastructure to be built out and can be deployed faster. So exciting to hear about all of that happening today. Colin, I'd like to go to you next. Experts agree there's an urgent need for greater climate finance flows from developed to developing countries. Making adequate finance available is crucial for making progress toward meeting the Paris goals. Previously, as our audience may know and remember, wealthy nations of the world had committed to channel 100 billion US dollars a year to less wealthy nations by 2020. Of course, that date has passed. This is meant to help those nations adapt to climate change and mitigate further rises in temperature. However, the wealthy nations missed that deadline. So why is it critical that they mobilize this $100 billion per year? And what are nations doing now to fulfill that promise?
Thank you, Julia. That's a really good question. I mean, I think the 2009 commitment to the 100 billion was a benchmark moment. The climate negotiations at that point in time were struggling to make real progress. And I think the challenge that we face with the climate negotiations is we know the scale of the need. We're seeing on an annual basis the impact of the failure of us to deliver on that need increasing, but we're still struggling to identify or reallocate the existing resources towards the sort of solutions that we need. So I think the challenge is obvious. The 100 billion was promised in 2009. It was promised to start flowing in 2020, the year the Paris Agreement entered into force. But sadly, it's now 2022. Current estimates are that 100 billion is not going to be reached until 2023 at the earliest. We're probably somewhere around 80 billion a year at the moment. And therefore, despite us knowing that there's this huge need for funding, the funding isn't flowing to where it needs to go. And I think what this is creating is really sort of two challenges. First of all, I think as a global community, we recognize that to tackle climate change, we've got to work together. And some countries, some organizations have more capacity to deliver. There's this idea within the Convention of common but differentiated responsibilities, recognizing different capacities as well. So in building on that solidarity, we've got to work together, and those that can contribute more need to contribute more. But I think the second issue, and one of the challenges the 100 billion really does create, is because it's taking us so long to get there, it's eroding trust in the overall process. And that is a real risk, because if the trust is lost in this global commitment, then what are we going to do to make sure that we deliver the climate action that's needed? So we've got this window of opportunity. We need to act now, and we need to meet that 100 billion as fast as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, the stakes are high. That trust erosion is definitely disconcerting. Let's go to Surabhi now. In recent years, we've seen small to medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs, appear to be severely underfunded. Firms with fewer than 250 employees are important players in all sectors of the economy. In Europe, there are more than 21 million companies in the SME sector, employing nearly 90 million individuals, thus contributing significantly to total job creation. Why should we worry about financing SMEs around the world, and what is their role in the clean energy transition?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I think in our view, and the World Bank substantiates this, that SMEs are the backbones of economy. They generate the most jobs. 7 out of 10 jobs come from SMEs. And so if we really want to uplift economies, we do need to be focusing on SMEs rather than the blue chip companies. I think they're the ones that enable innovation, tribute to the work that ARE is doing through Get Invest and investment readiness, because it's those companies that are actually going to be, the apples of our future. That's what we truly believe. But the challenge that they have is half of formal SMEs, don't have access to credit. The financing gap is even larger when you talk about micro and informal enterprises. This is where, and I have to do this, but this is where SunFunder has played a role. I should say that we are Morova SunFunder now. And one of the things that we've been doing through our funds, we've, closed about $200 million worth of funds across 60 investees. And, the majority of them have been with SMEs. One of the things that's really important for us, we are a debt provider. So, we come a little bit later in the stage than, ARE and Get Invest does. But I think what's important is that we still come in early enough, whether it's through lending or through our advisory arm, to really support those companies to enable access to financial markets, whether that's local capital, local bank capital, whether that's our own funds, or whether that's through equity, through our network. For us, we do see those as the catalyst, and especially if we're going to be talking about distributed renewable energy, we actually have to go outside of the urban areas and look at the companies that are acting in those communities and support them in their growth if we're really going to tackle the climate change issue, not only in just relation to access to energy, but it's great. It's all well and good to have access to electricity, but you need to use that electricity for something, right? So we're talking about whether that's lights or TVs, or solar water pumps or solar powered cooling. The uses there are endless, and we are seeing those solutions. It's actually one of the most favorite part of my job, is to be working with those companies and seeing, through PFAN, through ARE, through the grant programs, what are the new solutions that are being supported? And we want to start talking early to those companies. One of the things that we've actively, when SunFunder started, we did focus on the energy access space. And now we see, and so we're fundraising in order to be able to provide funding to these SMEs that are focusing on efficient cooling, e-mobility, circular economy, because all these solutions, this whole ecosystem around climate, are really key. And if you're talking to startups, they qualify as SMEs. That's where the growth is going to come from.
That's great. Yeah, it sounds like we're talking about dollars here, but I'm also hearing other types of support and expertise and knowledge sharing that sounds like is coupled with those dollars to ensure success, which is really fantastic work that you're doing. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So Rebecca, I'd like to go back to you. We just heard Surabhi mention new solutions. So we know that many of the technologies to tackle climate change exist already. About 60% of decarbonization solutions, however, that are still needed. There are still 60% of solutions that are still needed, So we have to get those solutions to commercial scale. Reduced investment and appetite and high cost of financing are making it hard to finance those solutions. They are widening the gap. So how can a private and public financing be mobilized to scale decarbonization efforts across different industries and technologies around the world, especially in harder to abate sectors or trickier to address markets? How do you address that gap?
Thank you for this question, Julia. So yes, as Surabhi was mentioning before, the long-term sustainability of decentralized renewable energy projects is intrinsically linked to economic development through productive uses of energy and industrialization. So increasing productive uses of electricity creates a win-win scenario for DRE companies, rural and peri-urban entrepreneurs, and governments as well. For example, with power generation playing a crucial role for the mining industry, decentralized renewable energy offers a variety of benefits, such as reliable and modern electricity supply, cost reduction, reduced environmental impacts, as well as the potential to mitigate climate change at scale. In this context, UNIDO ITPO Germany and ARE highlighted the opportunity for mining companies and renewable energy solution providers to enter into partnerships to move forwards towards a responsible and inclusive mining sector, which was also elaborated on in a recent publication. Another example, based on the best practices from the 15 case studies included in this publication and general observations, ARE and UNIDO ITPO Germany developed recommendations for public and private stakeholders that are working in the field in order to boost DRE uptake to power agricultural productivity.
No, and I think, Rebecca, those are great examples of collaboration between the public and private sector. And I think that's something that we want to see a lot more of. I think what we see is that private institutions, even when it comes to providing capital, we're able to get our hands dirty, we're on the ground in the markets, generally speaking, and we tend to move a lot faster. So, SunFunder and a number of other organizations are part of the UN Net Zero Alliance related to institutional financial institutions and asset managers, working on providing financing to address climate change. And oftentimes that's through blended finance vehicles. So there are multiple avenues of partnership, not just on the industry side, which I think is critical. Mining is a key sector, and I know we'll be talking about ESG as well, and how we incorporate that into the mix. But then also on the financial institution side, there is an enabling vehicle on that side that I think is also critical, and getting the money out faster, to Colin's point.
Interesting. Getting the money out faster and getting the money to the right people, I think is also critical as we're discussing here. So Colin, to you, how do we ensure that financial inclusion is central to everything we're talking about? Ensuring that it's also, reducing poverty and addressing inequality as we strive to meet the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So why is it so important to facilitate financial services in developing countries and ensure that inclusion in particular is central to that?
So that's a great question. I mean, the SDGs, the UN has estimated that to deliver on the SDGs, we need about 5 to 7 trillion a year investment targeted at the specific measures necessary to deliver on them. Now, I think the challenge for the small enterprises, for the developing countries, for those that we've talked about it already, it's not just about the money, it's about the capacity to be able to mobilize the money. And I think one of the fundamental challenges that a lot of developing countries, and particularly frontline communities, whether they're small and medium enterprises who need to access the funding, or whether they're communities facing climate impacts who need the funding to help them avoid those impacts in future, is do they have the capacity to be able to access the existing finance sources? And I think the Green Climate Fund is a really good example of how you can design a fund to be robust from a financial perspective, but then inaccessible for communities and small and medium enterprises in developing countries who don't have dedicated proposal writers, who don't have the sorts of accountants who can make the business case that we all know exists, but they don't have the right sort of language, the right sort of skills to be able to develop those proposals. So I think, it's not just about the amounts of money, it's also making sure that that money can reach those who need it the most. And it's a case of, I think, when we say those who need it the most, it's those who need it the most from a impact perspective, but also a catalytic change perspective. And if we could find those organizations, those communities who have got the the ability to innovate and change the system, then we might see that that impact spreading to other actors in the sector, to other communities. So yes, it's a challenge. It's not just about the money, it's also about the capacity to be able to access that money and the ability to mobilize that money. But I also think we've got to remember, though, that there's a bit of a cart and horse issue here as well. While the money is flowing slowly, it's not generating the opportunity to generate more consumption of the finance. And I think if we scale up the flows of finance, that's going to capacitate the system and it's going to have that positive feedback. So I wouldn't want investors to say, I'm not investing because I'm worried that this is not going to go where it needs to go. I think what we've got to do is we've almost got to swamp the system to get those good ideas to fruition, to really see the benefits, because it's not a case of I'm going to make profit or not profit. It's, am I going to tackle the climate challenge? Am I going to tackle the climate emergency? And that needs us all to act really fast. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Right. No, that's a really great point. And the climate emergency, but also growing these economies. What a great opportunity to see development and prosperity at the same time, if done correctly. Let me ask a quick follow-up question, Colin. You talked about, the capacity building, I guess, to access the funds. Is there a resource or a set of solutions that you would talk about? Because we're not, again, just talking about dollars and cents. We're talking about the capacity to access them. Are there programs that help startups do that? Or what else would you point our audience to?
I think the financial architecture within the Framework Convention on Climate Change is recognizing that this is a problem, that the majority of the funding is going to the bigger organizations, it's going to the middle income rather than the least developed countries. It's going to those solutions that we'd almost sort of say are business as usual. And I think particularly the Green Climate Fund has learned from that. They've developed packages of funding that are smaller. They've developed approaches whereby accredited agencies, non-accredited agencies can partner with governments, can partner with accredited agencies to access the funding. So you don't have to go through that 2-3 year accreditation process to be an implementer. So we're beginning to think about how to free up the process of accessing those funds. But it's 2022 now, and we should really have been doing this 5 or 10 years ago. But it's beginning to pay dividends. So the more we can do to free up the funding, the more that we can do to get the funding to where it needs to go, is going to help all of us deliver on this huge challenge. Thank you.
Right. So Robbie, I think I saw you nodding a little bit there. Do you have any quick thoughts on that before I give you another question?
Sure. No, I just 100% agree with Colin. It's not only about making sure that the money is there, but you're getting it to the people most in need. And I think one of the challenges that we see, when somebody is sitting in Europe or in the US, for example, you're not close to the market, you're not close to the ground, and you need to be working with actors on the ground. And, that's one part. The second is making sure it's the right type of capital, right? That if you want to be catalytic and build investment readiness and capacity build and so on, there's technical assistance out there to help with that. There are investment readiness programs, I reference Get Invest, there's PFAN that provides coaching, but still it's the question of how do, EEP does a great job with their grant program. We have a lot of EEP investees in our portfolio now. But how do they access those programs? And I think that's one of the big challenges that you see. There is a language barrier. As you've mentioned, you don't have proposal writers as well. And what we see is I'm based in Nairobi, and we see a lot of money coming into Nairobi. We see money coming into Nigeria. But what about the countries in between that we need to be catalyzing capital as well? And I don't have an answer, but I know that there's a lot of donor interest. I want to give credit to the Swedes here. I think they've been particularly active in this vein, but I think there's a lot more work to be done as well.
Sticking with you for a moment, Surabhi, I want to bring in the ESG discussion, environmental, social, and governance. We talked about sort of flooding the zone, getting a lot more capital, just moving and to not shy away from that. We are seeing this ESG trend start to drive more capital into sustainable investments. I think globally that's now topping around $30 trillion US. So what's driving the acceleration of ESG, do you think? And are those dollars starting to be connected to the SMEs we talked about, these sort of localized solutions? Is this broader trend actually starting to solve the problems we're talking about here today?
Yeah, look, I think right now ESG is a critical topic, and it should have been as part of our taxonomy for a long time. I think where we've actually started seeing the shift was in 2007 with the global financial crisis. And you can actually see it in the World Economic Global Annual Risk Report, where you can see now in that risk matrix that actually there's a larger focus on non-financial risks and how that affects companies. You know, we believe ESG is present throughout a business model, and especially now, you know, after the I guess not after the pandemic, but the height of the pandemic, we are seeing this take more precedence. And sometimes it feels like it's a hot and sexy topic, but it's actually really critical. And it's a fundamental part of when we're doing due diligence. You know, we're quite lucky with the companies that we work with that naturally what they're doing is impactful. Our belief is for the impact to be sustainable, the business has to be sustainable. So ESG is actually a framework of how resilient is your company to negative externalities. You know, we're seeing these questions around supply chain in relation to solar panels. You know, there was a New York Times article a few years ago that came out about saying that those in labor camps in China, the Uyghurs, were there was forced labor there. So how do you audit your supply chain? There's questions about waste management. You know, what are we going to do with all the batteries once they've run their life? How do we make sure that, you know, we're not just punting that problem down, kicking that can down the road rather? Then there's questions around health and safety. That should be a part of any company. That should be the forefront of what they're thinking about. Governance is key. And how are you making decisions? How transparent are you? Making sure that you aren't, you know, at risk of any bribery or corruption and so on. And it sounds, we've had these discussions with SMEs and they're like, you know, this is just fancy marketing, but actually we try to emphasize that it's important. We also recognize its trade-offs. Right? We don't expect everyone to fly to Western China, for example, to audit their supply chain, but it's having the checks and balances there that will actually make your business more sustainable in the long run. And for us, that is the key. I think the other thing that is important to recognize is that we're all still learning. I think, you know, the focus has really shifted. We're all still learning. ESG due diligence is evolving, and we learn a lot from our companies. And, you know, we see best practices in one and want to try to see if that is a fit for another. And, you know, Mirova SunFunder, we're quite lucky. We have a stellar ESG manager who's also backed by Mirova's ESG team of 16 people. And we work with our companies to actually build those action plans. I do think it's critical that companies really think about this. I read somewhere recently that 90% of the top 50 global asset managers in the world are signatories of the UN Principles of Responsible Investment. So investors, major investors across the world are looking at this. All the impact investors are looking at this. The DFIs are looking at this. And it should just be incorporated in the part of the thinking going forward.
Right. I think those commitments are meaningful. They're benchmarks. It's also important to track them and the performance against them. So it doesn't just end with a commitment, but we continue to see transparency around where the dollars are going. And we should also note that I think there's a lot of pressure to not only come up with these solutions, but to put ESG processes in place because it's a new venture. Like we're talking about some of these startups, now is the time to do that. It's also, I think, important to put some responsibility on established enterprises that they also have a responsibility to adopt these types of measures and not unilaterally put them on new and emerging companies. But I really appreciate those thoughts. We talked about challenges. Let's switch a little bit to opportunities. Rebecca, I'd like to go to you for this next one. What is the role of government and of public institutions in incentivizing private investment into the types of solutions and entities we're talking about here today?
Yes, thank you, Julia. So, well, basically, no amount of public money can achieve SDG 7 in the end. But rather, the role of public money should be to de-risk private investments and create the enabling environment for the DRE sector to thrive. This may, for example, include working with associations to ensure that 1, legislation is investment friendly, 2, we have clear and transparent electrification plans and policies in place. And number 3, we need the general ease of doing business. So it must be as good as possible.
Great. Colin, do you have any quick thoughts on how to mobilize public funding or government action to stimulate private investment?
Yeah, no, I mean, to follow up on what Rebecca said, I mean, I think the other thing that we've got to remember is the role of government is to sort of set those overarching targets, because without the commitment for net zero by 2050 or ideally 2030 in the developed countries, we need to bring that as fast forward as possible, because we've got the capacity, we should be acting. But in developing countries, yeah, we need that net zero by 2050. So governments have got to set that ambition. And then I think the important thing is governments don't just set those targets, but then also put in the pieces of the puzzle so that we can deliver those targets. Because the industry is looking for guidance. They're looking for pathways to go from where we are now to what we're going to look like to deliver that net zero target. And of course, bringing the ESG argument in, then of course, it's the role of government to ensure that the regulatory frameworks are in place, to ensure that those environmental, social, and governance safeguards are being met and adhered to. So I think we mustn't overlook the role of government as a facilitator of the process, as a shepherd of the process, and also as a monitor to make sure that that process is being met. Because ultimately, they're the target setter, they're the rule setter, and they should be taking those responsibilities to help us deliver these much needed actions. Thank you.
Great. Surabhi, over to you. You talked about, I think you were talking about the different sort of financing mechanisms and different types of finance. So what are some of the innovative investment vehicles that can be leveraged by private or public entities to both enhance returns, but also deliver on the green transition and the equity and inclusion elements we're talking about as well? So any examples would be great.
I think there are traditional financing products that have to be adapted to the markets that we're working with. If we think about the spectrum, there's basically grant, equity, debt. And how do you evolve those and adapt those solutions to the markets that we're working with? You know, grant is grant, and you figure out, okay, how do you structure that? Sometimes you just give the money, or you say, you know what, here's results-based financing. And that we've seen has been quite enabling. That first of all, it forces companies to get to know other investors because they have to pre-fund against the result. They have to finance it somehow to achieve that result. So that gains familiarity with the investor ecosystem, but it still allows, you know, deployment of assets. We see this particularly in the mini grid space across sub-Saharan Africa, that it's proven to be quite successful, slow, you know, to the point about government, and it needs to be enabling and standardized. These companies don't have major resources, but I think that's something that's quite important. On the equity side, you know, again, I think you're looking to fund managers that are on the ground or that are really active. In our space, we're seeing the likes of Acumen, Kawisafi, ADB Ventures, who are hands-on with their investees and working with them to help them access capital. I think those are the conduits because they're on the ground starting early. And really, if you want to work with SMEs, you have to have a willingness to write small tickets. When I say small tickets, you know, I'm talking about $500,000 upwards. Large institutional investors and public investors cannot do that because there's a lot of time and effort goes into that. And, you know, we also as financial institutions have to deploy money. That's how we're incentivized as targets, right? So I think actually going through the fund managers is really critical. And then you get to the debt side. Same story. You need to work through the fund managers. And I'm not just saying it's because SunFunder is a fund manager, but it is because we can actually start early, write those small tickets, and start working with companies to say, this is what you need to think about going forward. This is what the investors look at. And then investors in our funds are DFIs. So we can help them scale, move up the ladder, and then get access to, eventually the goal is commercial bank funding. And we're actually starting to see that with our investees, and investees where we started literally with 6-digit tickets. We're now talking about $25 million that we're able to provide them. So really, it's important that we start early with the companies. That's the role that the fund managers play. Start early, give them guidance, and help them scale and grow to achieve that.
Great. We're starting to wind down our conversation here. I do have one question from an audience member before I go to a final question for all three of you. Rebecca, I will direct this one at you. The question from an audience member that we got earlier is, why is multi-stakeholder collaboration so critical in bridging the funding gap to carbon neutrality? I'm sure you have to work with multiple stakeholders in your capacity with the Alliance for Rural Electrification. So please share your thoughts on this one.
Yes, thank you, Julia, and thanks also to the audience for asking this important question. So, well, basically, working in silos is inefficient. It is proven to not work out very well because different organizations have different expertise and roles. So working together allows us to have the full picture of what is needed, where, when, and how, as well as understanding the different whys, the different needs, the different requirements that are there in the field. So, this is also what Surabhi mentioned. Working locally with the people on the ground, with the companies on the ground, you understand what is actually needed there, what is the requirement, and how can you basically develop solutions that work together in co-creation, looking at the holistic picture, being as transparent as possible. And only collaboration allows all of us to solve these huge challenges we're facing in the world. It's not that the public sector, it's not that the private sector, nor the government achieving the results that improve, our world and heading towards a sustainable future. But collaboration allows for global response, addressing all the issues, all the 17 SDGs. And yes, at ARE, we are with over 185 members from different spectrums. We have NGOs, we have SMEs, we have also blue chip corporations. And that's also what makes the work so diverse and so exciting. And always, trying to address the different needs and being sort of forced to take different perspectives and look differently at aspects, and then jointly develop a solution that really addresses all the issues that are there.
Great. I actually have two final questions here. The first one I'll direct to Colin and then Surabhi, and then I have one very quick rapid fire to close us out. The question to Colin and Surabhi is to leave us with some insights on what your organizations are doing going forward to close the net zero funding gap, just briefly. Colin, first to you.
Okay, thanks, Julia. Well, Practical Action, we're a development charity, so we're working on 4 critical areas: renewable energy and energy access. We're working on urban systems, particularly slum communities and informal settlements. We're working on agriculture and the challenge of agriculture and changing climate, particularly smallholder-based systems. And then finally, the area of work that I lead on, which is around natural hazards, and helping communities prepare themselves so that those natural hazards can persist in the future, but they're able to thrive. Businesses are able to thrive in spite of floods and landslides, which we're not going to stop. So, those are the 4 areas that we work on, and I think what we bring to the climate challenge is we're working directly with communities who are on the front line. And as Rebecca just said, it's not just the government, it's not just the NGO community or the finance community. It's this we need to connect all of the key actors together. And this is what Practical Action aims to do. We aim to work across the spectrum. So we work with private sector, we work with local government, we work with national government, we work with other practitioners. We learn from them, we share our ideas with them. And it's the only way we're really going to, I think, achieve the scale that we need is by connecting up with the financiers, with the investors, because, you know, ESG is a great global idea, but unless it's put into practice on the ground, it's just words. And therefore, the delivery is going to be on those communities, it's going to be on those frontline SMEs, it's going to be, you know, making those climate actions tangible and delivering on this net zero challenge. So this is what Practical Action brings. We bring that ability to engage the communities, work with the small and medium enterprises that are on the ground where the changes actually need to start, and then connecting that up to the global level through the work we do with the various multilateral environmental agreements to ensure that that global policy framing supports actions and delivery at the front lines. Thank you, Julia.
Robbie, I know you're working on a lot, but if you could leave us with one thought of what SunFunder is doing to close that gap.
Sure. So SunFunder is actually a wholly owned subsidiary of Morova. We were actually acquired in June of this year. And I should first say Morova is an asset manager. They're a pioneer in impact and sustainable investing, managing 30 billion euros, focused on the energy transition. Primarily, it's been in OECD countries and natural capital. So whether that's sustainable agri, forestry, oceans, et cetera. SunFunder has come in as effectively the emerging markets arm, focused on the energy transition, as well as supporting on the other thematics. You know, to date, we're managing just under $150 million worth of assets, but we believe we've built a very strong track record and are currently fundraising a new $500 million fund that it continues to focus on distributed renewable energy and storage, but also other enabling solutions, that's smart metering or e-mobility, efficient cooling. And then beyond that, we have bigger ambitions, you know, whether we're looking at emerging markets, equity, whether we're expanding on natural capital, and that's, you know, the organization as a whole. So for us, you know, addressing the finance gap is in our DNA. It's what we've been doing. We've been on the front lines on that side. We continue to want to be a pioneer and an innovator on that side, and particularly support pioneering and innovative companies through our different financing solutions.
Great. The rapid fire round is in one word. How would you describe the future of sustainability? Rebecca, Colin, then Surabhi.
Sure. So for ARE, it's booming because of the high potential we believe to be in there.
Fantastic. Colin?
For Practical Action, I think it's change. Big change starts small. We need change, and we need it now.
Surabhi?
I think exciting. I think we are seeing a lot of momentum. I think we're seeing a lot of money come into the space. I think we're seeing a lot of new innovative business models. And so really, I think, you know, we're at a tipping point and just really excited for what's to come and what we're going to see in the next few years.
Great. With that, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much to our guests for their valuable insights and for the work you're all doing every day. Thanks so much to our audience for tuning in. And if you would like to watch this entire session, it will be posted on the Zayed Sustainability Prize's YouTube channel. Thank you. Thank you. I'm Julia Piper. It's a pleasure to be here. Until next time.